And I'd like to introduce Jeff Smith, who will be our host and moderator for the town hall with Daniel Biss.
Thank you, Megan. Megan had the honor of serving as the president during one of the most challenging years that Evanston has ever had, namely dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's largely due to her efforts, as well as everybody else on the board, that we managed to stay active and vital despite lockdown, despite masks, despite social distancing. And in fact, if nothing else, we probably had more participation than ever through this new technology called Zoom, of which I hope you're all shareholders. So thank you. And if the board of Central Street Neighbors could stand and be recognized, and everybody could give them a round of applause for This is our 15th year, so I suppose actually it's our 14th. I don't know if it's our 14th or 15th annual meeting, but it's certainly our 15th meeting at least. And we got started with people coming together, working initially about zoning issues, but really it expanded into the entire gamut of issues that runs up and down the so-called Central Street corridor, from the Westmoreland Golf Course to the Lighthouse. And of course, we're interested in everything that goes on in Evanston as well, as is everybody in Evanston, because getting in each other's business is our strong suit. So thank you all for coming. There's a lot of things to do on any given busy summer night. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, a resident of Central Street himself, our relatively newly elected mayor, and making his first live in-person appearance before the Central Street Neighbors. I hope it won't be his last. Please give a warm round of applause to Daniel. Format here is going to be pretty loose. Daniel's going to give a few introductory remarks, and then we'll turn it over to whatever the rabble wants to do. And I meant me. We have distinguished guests here, and everybody here is an interested citizen. But I'm hoping it'll be an open and freewheeling conversation. The only rules will be no personal attacks, no ad hominem, and don't give any speeches longer than mine. So, Daniel is.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. Thanks, as always, to the Central Street Neighbors Association for, you know, when you run for office during a pandemic, you encounter a tremendous number of brand new civic organizations that perhaps come into existence, you know, between 20 minutes and an hour and a half before the Zoom forum that they hold. And that's really nice. I mean, that's a beautiful thing about Evanston. People are passionate and they show up and they care. But let's not forget that persistence is enormously beneficial quality as well. And the Central Street Neighbors have been, as you said, doing this for 14 or 15 annual meetings worth of advocacy. And it's, you know, obviously it's a mark of positive character traits, but it's also a gift to the city in the form of institutional memory that I think is enormously valuable, particularly right now as we have a new mayor, a new clerk, 4 new council members. To have people who've been in these discussions for a few years really helps. So I just want to say thank you to that. Congratulations to President Megan and to the newly elected slate, and just thanks for all that you do. And I do want to recognize Council Member Eleanor Revelle of the 7th Ward, who's kind enough to join us tonight. And so I was, you could tell by my body language how carefully I prepared my opening comments that Jeff just informed me I was going to be making. I don't think it's necessary to go into specific issues. Obviously, I'll let the rabble, as you put it, guide that part of the evening. I just want to say that these first couple months of a new council have been an incredible education for me I think what we see is an extraordinary moment of ferment, a time when we have a lot of new people, as I mentioned, on council, a lot of differing attitudes about what the key priorities are and how to sort out those disputes among priorities. And I've spent, I would say, an enormous amount of my first 7 weeks just trying to best as I can help navigate those relationships, bring people together, provide for constructive and useful discussions between people who might not see eye to eye on questions, whether those are elected officials with other elected officials with staff, residents with all of us, residents with each other. And I think that it's going to be bumpy, but I think that we're all going to benefit from that, because fundamentally I think that bumpiness is a product of an enormous diversity on our council. And that diversity is reflective of this community. And once we figure out how to best and most efficiently work together, we'll be able to have the kind of council this community deserves, which is one that is truly diverse in many different respects and able to represent the many different points of view that this community has. So I'm excited. I am very hopeful. I'm possibly slightly exhausted. And I am most of all certain that the mechanism by which we achieve success will be in the Evanston way, which is to say with an enormous amount of public engagement and input. And I know that I can count on the Central Street Neighbors Association to be a part of that. And for that, I just say again, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
We ask people to send in questions, and if you don't want to stand up and ask your question personally, if you want to write it down and hand it up for the sake of anonymity, you're free to do that. I'm going to start with one that was emailed into us this week. Dan, Evanston's original climate action plan set the goal of, quote, an adequate supply of affordable housing, which they defined as making the cost of the city's overall housing stock mirror the ability to pay of those who were employed in Evanston. And the reason that was part of the climate action plan is because if people can live here, they don't have to be driving throughout Cook County or other counties in order to get here, and also because it was considered part of sustainability to make it affordable for people to live here. So the question is that a realistic goal? There's talk of updating the land use policies. This is a long question. In the city's strategic and comprehensive plans. So what specific actions do you see as the focus to meet the need in Evanston for an adequate supply of affordable housing, if that's possible in a market economy?
Yeah, well, it's a very ambitious goal given the status quo today, right? If you think for a moment about some of our bigger employers, right? It is certainly affordable for Northwestern professors to live in Evanston, though some may not think so, but it is. But it's not affordable for all Northwestern staff by any means to live in Evanston. It is certainly affordable for the physicians who work at our 2 hospitals to live in Evanston. It is not affordable for all of their staff to live in Evanston. And you could go on and on and on and give more examples like this across town. I am of the view that when it comes to these fundamental questions about how we organize ourselves in terms of transit and work and housing, we have to think big. We have to be bold in our ambition, and so that involves, for instance, I think retaining this as an appropriate long-term goal. Another goal that I think is just adjacent to this one, let's say, and similarly ambitious, is the notion of being a 15-minute city, which is to say a community where with a 15-minute walk from any residence, you can achieve that which you need, whether it's healthy food, or whether it's a neighborhood public school, obviously a hot item, or whether it's access to work where you are employable. That's another goal about sort of how we physically organize ourselves that we are millions of miles away from achieving. But if we actually take seriously both our commitment to real building of solid community as well as achievement of these climate goals, that's got to be where we head. So is it achievable? Not right now. It's a long-term goal, but I think it's the right long-term goal to aim for over the course of time, understanding that progress is going to be incremental. And the the changes that can be made when it comes to policy around increasing the stock of affordable housing are, partially around supply and partially around subsidy. So for example, just last night, the council authorized the city manager to enter into an agreement with the Housing Authority of Cook County to consider proposals for what I think is called Lot 1. It's a parking lot in the 3rd Ward on South Boulevard, which is right now a kind of underutilized city-owned parking lot right next to an L station, very close to the lakefront and near one of our medium-sized business districts. And so the notion of trying to figure out a way to develop truly affordable housing on that property is a very exciting way of addressing these issues from the supply side. There's a lot more that could be done in that direction, though, again, one has to be cautious about how far one goes and what kind of other costs come with progress one makes in that direction. But I think simultaneously, if we want to achieve the ambitious goal that your correspondent asks us about, we've got to find a significantly enhanced subsidy. I think we have to be somewhat realistic about how much that's going to come from the city coffers, and therefore creative about really trying to find federal funding and other external sources, which is, it always sounds like a great solution until you don't succeed, and then you're short. And so I don't think we have a clearly mapped out, 47-point plan to get from here to everyone who works in Evanston can find truly adequate, affordable housing that's consistent with the principle of ensuring they spend at a very most 30% of their income on housing. But I think there's a number of steps that we can and should take, and I think that we have to be aiming in that direction.
Thank you, Dan. There, you see how easy it is to ask a question. So we'll open it up. Who wants to be first in the audience? I'm sure you came here with thoughts, comments. Yes, in the back.
I can talk that. My question.
Oh, Mary, come on up. Don't have my glasses on.
My question is about the tips and the fifth tip that seems to be moving along very quickly, and I hope it's not going to be. There's been one meeting so far that's been public and another joint board. However, that TIF involves about 50% public land, which I feel like if that public land were to get sold, it would be nice to have a base that goes to all of the residents in Evanston. So I'm very concerned about that TIF and open discussion on the pros and cons of that. What is your thought?
Yeah, so there's been talk about what's been called a 5/5 TIF, a 5th Ward TIF that, as I understand it, would include the current Civic Center property, but also points west of there within the 5th Ward. The presumption, I think, Mary correctly points out, is that the Civic Center property would not remain public in perpetuity. Otherwise, it's sort of confusing as to why it matters whether it's in the.
I'm just going to interject for those not familiar with the acronym. TIF stands for Tax Increment Financing, by which a portion of land is set aside and the increase in taxes that come from that district are all put back into the district rather than into the general coffers.
Sorry, thank you. That was an important interruption. The point, not only is it good to define an obscure acronym, but it's also good to point out that usually a TIF means, hey, here's the current value of the property, and if it becomes this much more valuable, the extra tax revenue generated by that extra value will go to this special purpose that's local to the area. But in the specific instance of and I'm not as much of an expert on the sort of underlying statutes governing TIF as I maybe used to have people think I was. But my assumption is that if the property itself transfers from being off the tax rolls altogether to being private and therefore taxable, the entirety would be the so-called increment, because it's starting on a base of 0. So I think part of the reason why this has been a topic that's gotten a lot of attention, not to mention the kind of emotional attachment that many people have to the Civic Center as the seat of our municipal government. So my view is that Mary is completely right. This is an important issue. It's a big decision. It would be a terrible shame to make it in a way that didn't include opportunities for adequate public input. I think I'm candidly, and we've talked about this privately, I think I'm more of an optimist than Mary. I don't see us heading in that direction. I think there's a lot of public discussion, a lot of concern. I don't think this is the kind of issue that the council would feel comfortable just kind of rushing through without adequate public input. But I agree that if that were to be the outcome, that would be a real shame. And I think it's important for those of us in elected positions to ensure that we create adequate opportunities to make sure that all the different aspects of this multifaceted conversation are properly aired out. The question of where the seat of city government ought to be, the question of what ought to be done with these new tax revenues if that property were to be taken off the tax rolls, the question of how to achieve the equity goals that are underlying the current proposals of the 5/5 TIF that are floating around, which are, I think, really critical equity goals for the TIF board. We got to talk about all this stuff really adequately and openly. And I think if I had the concern that we were going to see this just done under the cover of darkness, I'd be pretty concerned. But fortunately, I don't think we're on that path.
Just a follow-up question, Daniel, you may not have been in Evanston at the time, but one of our first forum meetings, we had then Cook County Commissioner Mike Quigley come out and speak, and he educated us all on the evils of TIF financing. And of course, I come from the 49th Ward, and David Orr has been a long foe of what's been called abuse and overuse of tax increment financing, ranging from with the alleged evils being everything from inequity to ineffectiveness to subsidy to developers. So it's generally kind of opposed by good government folks. Why does Evanston keep going to this well?
So I'm going to focus my response on the insinuation at the beginning of your question. I have recently crossed my 15-year anniversary as an Evanstonian. We might have the same birthday, Central Street Neighbors Association and Daniel the Evanstonian. I think the TIF critics are mostly right, or have make a lot of important and correct points. And you were actually kind of a little generous in your rendering of the sort of traditional criticism of how TIFs get done in Chicago, which is essentially that you create a slush fund without meaningful oversight, and in the name of addressing so-called blight and creating opportunity where there otherwise wouldn't be, you in fact just instead build a tool for politicians to direct money toward the people who have the ear of politicians, who are typically the people who least need the money. That's the criticism, and if you look at the history of TIFs in Chicago, that's been a fair criticism many times. I don't think there's anything wrong with the theory of TIFs, with the concept of using that additional value to fulfill an economically rational local function. I think it's fundamentally all about oversight and all about controls. And I think you could tell a lot of different plausible stories about the extent to which we've effectively utilized proper oversight here in Evanston, but I don't think the reaction to what's gone wrong with TIF should be oppose it in all circumstances, no matter what. I think the reaction should be a healthy skepticism, a looking under the hood, and then making sure that even after something has been enacted, or perhaps even especially after something has been enacted, there's really a close eye being put on the question of where these dollars are going and who's really making the decisions to ensure that the fundamental problem, which is really a corruption problem, doesn't creep into our situation.
Thank you. And anytime the word slush fund comes up, we're having a good conversation, right?
I actually have a poster on my office wall that says just that.
Next question. If you so wish, please state your name.
Oh, sure. Mike Hartnett, Hartsell Street. In fact, I see you and your family walking by every now and then, I think. So, Mr. Mayor, I watched one of the debates earlier this year with the three candidates online, and the topic, at one point, the topic of defunding the police came up. And your answer to the question I thought was pretty good. You didn't dodge the question, but you sort of changed the question into, are there some things that the police do now that could be done in a different way? Fair enough. But to get back to it, defunding would be essentially abolition, in another word. And I think it's not put that way because that's just so stark. And I was wondering if you could possibly reject that idea tonight out of hand, because anyone who says Black Lives Matter but wants to defund the police, they're lying about one thing or the other.
Well, I will happily answer that question without ducking anything and do so directly. I'm not sure that I would agree with the last thing you said. I think there's room for disagreement between people, and I think there are people who sincerely believe that abolition is the right way to create a just society, and you and I personally don't agree with that, and you obviously don't either, but I don't know that it means they're lying. I think they have a different view of what's possible than I do. I am not an abolitionist. I don't support abolition. I think that it is, I think we can all agree that it is a fundamental responsibility of government. As you know, government is a thing that we build when we come together to solve problems that we can't solve on our own. One of those problems clearly is the problem of safety. And I think that, unfortunately, it is impossible for me to envision a situation where we can keep ourselves safe without maintaining in our arsenal of potential solutions the ability to deploy force. I think we probably overuse that capability right now, but I think the ability to deploy force is a necessary tool, and the police are the appropriate body to utilize that tool. And so I'm not an abolitionist, and I have friends who are. I respect them a great deal, but I don't agree with them. That's not the policy vision that I support. Now, the reason that I shied away from using the phrase defund the police is very simple. I think it means really different things to different people, and I think it's dangerous for a candidate for office or an elected official to use language that communicates different things to different people, because then they're effectively making incompatible promises to different people. I think some people who say defund mean abolition, essentially. I think some people who say defund refer to what's already happening with the Alternative Emergency Response Subcommittee that Councilmember Revelle has done such great work on, which says, hey, listen, police aren't the right people to be dealing with some of the mental health crises that they're currently being called to solve. So let's stand up a true capability to have the trained professionals who are the right folks to address those problems, be the ones who we call in to address them. And that's going to require some money, some spending money on a new capability, and taking some jobs that never should have been on the police's plate off their plate, which might mean the redirecting of some resources. So some people mean that when they say defund, some people mean abolition, some people mean all kinds of things in between, but I don't believe that abolition is the correct path. What I do believe is that the approach that the Alternative Emergency Response Subcommittee is a part of the direction we ought to be going, which is just to say, listen, the special, unique thing about police, the thing that differentiates a police officer from a Health and Human Services department worker or a Parks and Rec worker or the person who answers the phones, well, the person who used to answer the phones at the Civic Center and one day will again, the thing that separates them, the reason that a police officer becomes a police officer with a ceremony where they take an oath and are given a badge, is that with that oath and that badge comes the capability of deploying violence, of going to work with a gun and even utilizing it under some circumstances, of going to work with handcuffs and placing people under arrest and taking away their liberty. That is an awesome set of capabilities that I don't think are the right set of capabilities to solve many of the problems that we encounter in our society. And what I want to do is make sure that we're tailoring our solutions to the problems. So we use the folks with the guns and the handcuffs to solve the problems that need to be solved with a city worker with a gun and handcuffs. And we build the capacity to solve the problems that aren't best solved by a city worker with a gun and handcuffs by somebody else who's properly trained and equipped with the skills and capabilities and knowledge that they need.
Thanks, Dan, and if you don't mind, I'll have a sort of a quick follow-up. We're here in an American Legion Hall, and we've got a number of veterans in the room, and I think probably everybody in this room has total respect for anybody who served and put their life on the line. And policing is hard work too, but policing is very different from soldiering. And we have currently in this country, and I don't know to what extent in Evanston, military preference in hiring for police. And there's also concerns about the militarization of the police. Do you agree? Is that something that we need to work on as military preference, something that we should continue to have for police in order to move towards the model of adapting to the different challenges that go beyond the use of force that we run into?
Well, I'll confess to not knowing about the military preference question in our own police hiring process, so I don't feel equipped to answer that part of the question at this time. I think in general, the militarization of our police, the utilization of surplus military equipment, which is something that we do here in Evanston, is problematic. There was an incident about a month ago that some folks here may be aware of, where a police officer was on a shift change, walking from the station to the squad car, and was sort of casually carrying a surplus military assault style weapon. And there happened to be a protest going on, being put on by the Evanston Fight for Black Lives, exactly where he was walking. And so, though it turned out there was no apparent intent for the two events to be related, it sure felt like to the protesters like this military style weapon was being brandished, let's say, in an effort to send a message. And so, I had a lot of conversations with protesters and the chief and other officers who were on the scene, and I actually viewed the body camera footage and wound up very confident that it really was not, that it really was a coincidence that the protest occurred at the same time as shift change. But I also said, well, now hold on, why are we carrying military style weapons just out in the open on the street? Whether or not there's a protest going on, there are probably a lot of Evanstonians who would be deeply uncomfortable seeing that. I am one of those Evanstonians. And the chief got back to me and pointed out, we actually have a policy that talks about not carrying weapons like this out in the open. And we really hadn't kind of thought about the implications of that policy on this act that we conduct every single day of moving the weapons from the station to the squad car. So you're right, from now on we're going to carry those in a case. And so that was a step in the right direction toward acknowledging the impact that a weapon like that has on the attitudes and psychology of a lot of folks who would be walking in the street and seeing it. But it leaves unanswered the basic question of, and I think you put it very well, Jeff, a police department is, policing is difficult work, and it is work that puts people at risk, and they are to be appreciated and honored for putting themselves at that risk. But it's different than military service, and the shrinkage of that gap in the tactics, strategies, equipment, and frankly, public imagination, I think is problematic and something we need to really be examining seriously.
Thanks for your answer. Next question. Nice to see you, Sigrid.
My name is Sigrid Pilgrim, and I don't have so much.
I'll hold this for you.
I don't have so much a question, and given the seriousness of all these questions, maybe you will think that this is really a trivial request. About 2 years ago, living in the area right next to Lovelace Park, the Hillside Neighborhood Association established a little group called Friends of Lovelace Park. And our intent was to, number one, provide assistance to the city parks crew in terms of maintenance of the park. So we have mulched the trees, we have weeded the playground, we have spread the wood chips, we clean up after the pond over flooded. We have a group called the treasure hunters that go treasure hunting after lots of people leave their cans and bottles all over the place. And we have also had the goal to establish a pollinator garden, which with city permission, we established last year. We raised $820, which we gave to the city to help enlarge the pollinator garden, and hopefully also put up a sign, and this is where the request to you comes in. North of the sledding hill is an area that we lovingly call the swamp, because when it rains hard, the ducks have a really great time. So we've asked the city not to mow it. And they didn't last year, but then they mowed it, and I have a friend and a neighbor.
Wait, did they actually mow it?
They did. Yes, they did. And I made a big mistake, because one of my neighbors is a soil scientist who works at the Botanic Garden. She's very interested in what happens under the ground, not so much above ground. So she gave me about 1.5 pounds of native wildflower seeds to put in to the now mowed area. Well, I made a big mistake. I should have just broadcast them. But I let the city know, and I was told in no unmistakable terms, you may not do that. And if you do it, when the plants come up, we will mow them down. Well, anyway, in there are almost 100 signatures on petitions, which we passed around earlier in the year, with the request to please not mow the area, which right now, part of it is not mowed. And number two, please allow us to put some wildflower seeds in. And then we would just simply love to call it the Lovelace Meadow. And the leftover funds could be used for the city to make up a sign to put right there next to the meadow. So again, you know, in the overall scheme of things and the questions that have been raised, it's really trivial. But, you know, we do have a kind of a environmental action plan, you know, that would pretty much kind of like follow that. And without any further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Sigrid.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And I was aware of this. It was a sort of Kafkaesque story on our side regarding the mowing or non-mowing, and I thought it had been resolved, and so I'm a little alarmed to hear that it was in fact mowed. I want to zoom out a little bit, because I think this is an area where I would like to really effectuate a change in our city government. You know, we have like, for example, many of you probably know Kumar Jensen, our Chief Sustainability Officer. Our community has ambitious sustainability goals and a deep, deep well of passionate, committed, knowledgeable residents who want to help us achieve those goals. Kumar, who is actually leaving the city shortly, which is a different conversation, and you know, he's done extraordinary work for us, and we're sad to see him go. Kumar is an extraordinary person who's done phenomenal work, but there's just one of him. And we haven't authorized the cloning project to proceed as of yet. And so in order for us to get where we need to go as a city on our climate goals, we are going to need to figure out a way to incorporate all of the massive amounts of expertise and passion and commitment across this community that would like to be deployed to help. So that's one example, and I could give many more issue areas where there's really an alignment between what resident volunteers have to offer and what the city's own goals and priorities are, but it's just sometimes institutionally difficult to kind of open up the windows and let the volunteers in and kind of hand over the keys. That metaphor was catastrophically mixed, I apologize. And so we are losing out as a community on an opportunity to do better by saying to our overworked, undercompensated staff, you have to do everything alone. And I think if we can figure out a way to better partner with volunteers and community organizations, we'll do better. And look, it's institutionally tricky, right? Because, you know, we can fire a bad employee and then hire a different person to replace them tomorrow and eventually find someone to get that job done, but you can't fire a volunteer, and you can't replace a volunteer group that gets bored after a couple of years and stops. And there's all these reasons why organizations are hesitant to rely too much on volunteers, but I think we've gone too far in the other direction, and we're all losing out because of it. So this is an important example, and I would love to work with you on this, and I think it's part of a bigger kind of change in attitude that could really, really help us a lot if we were to take advantage of it.
Thank you. Any other?
My name's Ellen Logan. We live in the 2500 block on Lawndale, and last summer in the 2 other blocks further south, the water main pipes were being replaced, and it was a big unexpected expense to people who chose to do it. And supposedly the 2500 block is going to have it done this summer, but we haven't had any information about it. So I wondered, and maybe somebody else knows, and I don't know if it's connected with what's going on down Harrison, all those big pipes, but yeah, I mean, it's just like, we've kind of been waiting, and because it's such a big investment, if you choose to do it, yeah.
Yeah, let's exchange contact information before I leave, and I can talk to the Public Works Department and get an answer for you.
Okay.
I'm going to take the liberty of a follow-up on that, Daniel. As you know, a lot of houses in Evanston have lead in the service lines running to the homes because they were built so long ago. It's very expensive if you want to replace your service line, either for, say that you just wanted to get rid of the lead, or because you put in an extra shower head and now you need more pressure, and which inspectors will recommend. Could we make it a standard city policy that when they're tearing up the water mains, that they say to residents, hey, this would be a real good time to replace your service line because we already have the street open, and rather than occurring to people 5 years after the fact.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, additionally, the legislature in Springfield passed a new law in May to significantly accelerate, for the first time on a state level, require the replacement of all lead service lines by a certain, I think it's 34 or 35 years from now. And that enormously accelerates the plan that we were already on. We were on a 100-year plan, and so the time got cut in 3. And so that will accelerate this work, and will also obligate us as a city to make sure the work occurs and is funded.
And do we have the funds to do that? Because that was one of the protests of the municipalities. And
right.
In fact, before you were mayor, so it's not on your charge, but the city of Evanston actually opposed the bill in Springfield.
Yes. That is a thing that happened. Regarding whether we have the money, does anybody here, I just need one data point. Does anybody here have Joe Manchin's cell phone number? It's expensive. It's I think the incremental cost of going from the 100-year plan to the 35-year plan is in today's dollars an additional $3 million. So it's a serious cost. I think, all kind of feeble attempts at humor aside, there really is an expectation there's going to be serious federal help. But I think it's the municipality's protest was, wait for the feds to pass the law, sending us the money, and then create the mandate. And the legislators' attitude was, we hope the feds fund it, but we also think from a public health standpoint, it's too important not to do, even if they don't. Respectfully, I agree with what the legislature did, even though I know that some are concerned about the cost implications. But certainly if the federal government doesn't come up with any resources, it will be a burden for us, no question.
Other questions? What am I seeing here? Did I see a hand up?
I'm Mary Roth. I don't need that. I thought for too long.
Okay, Mary.
We're recording. I'm Mary Rothschild, and I live right down here on Sunset Street on the west side of the tracks. But it's been a long we're right in the middle of all this debate about Northwestern and the use of their facilities, which are just right up here on the street. And there was, and I had attended all those meetings about the discussion about increasing the number of events that they were going to have at the field house, or whatever they call it now. It's still Dyke Stadium to me. So what I want to know is where are we on that process? Because I know that the COVID kind of intervened in all that, so it kind of set back, I think, what they were calling the trial period.
That's right.
And so where are we with all that? And will the community be allowed to speak again on that? Because I really felt that our last communications, when we had those open meetings, were not where I felt that there was a real willingness to listen to the community on the part of Northwestern, and instead kind of dismiss us and kind of move forward. So I just want to kind of know where we are on that.
So the status is that the thing that was passed a few years ago was a 2-year pilot. Those 2 years were last year and this year, and Northwestern was like, well, but now hold on. That wasn't really the point. Was not to try to have imaginary events during a pandemic. And so they came back and asked for first they asked for a 2-year extension, which, so just sort of do it all over again, which failed in the last council before I came in. And then at the last minute, as the councils were switching over, they updated their request to a 1-year extension, and in an 8-to-1 vote, that failed. And I'll have to acknowledge, and I hope this is a popular thing in this room, otherwise I'm acknowledging for ill, but you know, Mary Rosinski was an important voice in communicating the concerns of residents who didn't want to see it happen, and Councilmember Revelle was really fundamentally a leader in rounding up the votes and articulating the concerns of folks who felt like this was not a good idea. So as it stands, the pilot has not been extended. It ends at the end of the year. My assumption,
This year.
yeah. So my assumption was, you know, I don't know how you feel about it, but as far as I can tell, it's June. There's a lot of year left, and that they could utilize some of this existing authorization to try a few events and see how it goes, and see if they can prove to the neighbors that it actually isn't as big a deal as the neighbors are concerned it would be. I don't have any indication from them that they're actually going to go ahead and do that. But certainly at this time, there doesn't seem to be support to go beyond that. I was a little surprised the vote was 8-1. It's not, sometimes, you know, these votes are a little funny. They're sort of social experiences, right? Like once something is clearly going to go one way or the other, often everyone jumps on board. So that may not mean there are 8 people who are dead set against it, but I do think that that lopsided outcome sent a message as well.
These are great questions and comments. And Mark.
Hi, it wouldn't be a meeting without me talking about finances, so let me just throw a couple things out at you. Okay, thank you. The question is, we have this nice pool of COVID money that we're trying to figure out what to spend on. 43 million, is that what I hear?
Yep.
The question becomes, as a resident for 20 years here, my property taxes are continuing to grow and grow and grow and grow, and our schools are asking for more, and District 65 is telling us they're going to be in big trouble in a few years. My hope is that we use this money to invest in the future and invest in allowing us to enhance our property taxes and our sales taxes and things like that, so it brings back a return that we really can use. My concern is we're Evanston. Social issues, social justice, a lot of these things require investment in dollars that don't have the kind of return that we need to kind of keep property taxes low. So how do you balance that? And how do we kind of use some common sense to figure out how to spend this, or not spend, invest this money?
So I'll first answer the question that I thought you were going to ask, but you didn't, which is, can we just use this money to lower property taxes? The answer to that is no. That's actually in the law. Do you mind if I give like a 5-minute answer for this one?
That would be shorter than some.
I really walked into that one. That was.
Sorry, I was a softball player.
No, I mean, that was, I asked for that.
No, finances are important. Mr. Mayor, take the time you need.
So the enumerated places this money can be, and I want to just first of all repeat back the question because I think you're right? You're right about this one highly specific thing. Government isn't used to this kind of opportunity, right? We know how to set up a program and then continue to run it. But this is a one-time investment. This is $43 million coming from Washington that's not going to come again. And so we have to figure out how to truly invest it in choices that will bring long-term return. So we are allowed to do, I think there's 5 major topics. One is just making up for lost revenue. The city lost a bunch of revenue, we can just fill that hole. One is public health investments, and I would say that's interpreted pretty broadly. So it would include mental health, for instance, which is of course a critical area where we have significant need that has been greatly exacerbated by the pandemic. That's 2. The next is premium pay for essential workers. We can say to city essential workers who are obligated to put themselves at risk, whether it's public safety workers or folks at the food pantry or whatever else, hey, here's a token of our appreciation, here's a premium pay on top of the salary that you were paying. The next is infrastructure narrowly construed, infrastructure only for water, sewer, or broadband, but with the explicit proviso that may be utilized to mitigate the effects of climate change. And then finally, economic recovery. And so I think all of these areas are important and valuable, but I do think that different areas should be thought of in different ways as regards the extent to which they're long-term investments in kind of the trajectory of our community. I think the economic recovery portion of it is the clearest example of that. And I think it's really important to name that economic recovery is a really broad category, right? I think people probably mostly just kind of picture, grants to like, oh, that restaurant barely made it, but now they're going to go under if they don't get a little grant. We'll give them a grant to tide them over, that sort of thing, which is real and a legitimate potential use of the funds. But there's also things like, workforce development to create opportunities for disconnected youth in the areas that we see are going to be growing necessarily, like, for example, the replacement of lead service lines. There's also the provision of childcare for people who are locked out of the workforce because of a lack of access to childcare. There's also kind of, there's a lot of thought going on right now about what does it take to market Evanston to businesses that are looking to spin off satellite locations, given the changed work patterns that are likely to come into being in the wake of the pandemic. So when it comes to revenue loss, the decision making is a number. How many millions of lost revenue do we think it's the highest and best use of this American Rescue Plan Act money to just replace? When it's things like public health, that's a very difficult set of decisions because there's so many different ways to provide the critical health services that we're not providing enough of in this community. Again, I want to stress mental health is an area where I think there's a particular need and a lot of different ways we could go. But then I think getting this economic recovery piece of it right and not treating it as here's what's on my mind. We could just say, okay, we'll have some process. It'll lead us to conclude that of the 43 million, pick a number, 5 million is going to go to economic recovery, and now we're open for business. We're willing to accept applications from anybody who wants to kind of get their hands on a piece of that money, and then that's how we're going to allocate it. I think that's fine, but we need to first actually establish our own strategy. What does investment in our economic future look like? What is the economic future we're trying to build towards and invest to bring about? And then what's our internal strategy of how to make that happen, rather than just sort of waiting to see kind of who wants a slice of the pie. The flip side of that, though, and I'll stop here, is that because this is a once in a generation opportunity, that's a kind of thing that's not kind of in our government's muscle memory. I'm sorry, cigarette, that wasn't on purpose. We want input. We want folks at the table. I actually just came from a Spanish language town hall meeting that's still going on at the Ecology Center, where there's really great attendance of people who are asking a lot of tough questions about the city's finances in Spanish. People have never had the opportunity to ask a city staffer a difficult financial question in Spanish. We had a Zoom town hall about a week ago. We had an in-person town hall at the Crown Center about a week before that. All these are really, really good, but they're the beginning of a marathon. They're sourcing ideas. They're kind of taking temperature. Once we've done all that sourcing, we're going to have to do a lot of narrowing. And that narrowing process also needs to be done with the community at the table. So I'm pushing internally to make sure that we have a really, really robust engagement process pursuant to which we make these decisions. And I would just ask you to if you believe in that, push with me on the outside to make sure we and I've said this in the forum that you hosted actually, that, or maybe I did. I said something related to this in my life before, possibly in response to a question Jeff asked. Transparency is good, and a lack of transparency is bad. But worse than a lack of transparency is fake transparency. Pretending to care, but not actually caring is worse than just being honest about it. And so I really want us to not only say we care and have an event, but work together to design an event where the conversations will be of a level of sophistication and the feedback will be careful and representative enough that we can actually then go and act on what we hear. And that's not as simple as having everybody show up to the Crown Center and raise their hand one at a time. It's really structured, facilitated conversations. It asks a lot of residents to give that much of their time, and that in turn asks a lot of us to make sure we're then getting a truly representative cross-section of the community, as opposed to just those who happen to have the most time. And I think if we do all that, we're going to get a way better product for our community.
Thank you. That's a very good answer.
Mayor, I'm Laurie McFarland. I was wanting to ask you, because I heard you during the campaign talk about reforming the comprehensive general plan for the city. And I thought there was some interesting debate about that at some recent city council meetings. Specifically, you know, what are we putting in this work for? What do we want to have this thing do? I was curious to hear your, if you could identify kind of the top one or two flaws or problems that you see with the current plan, and the top one or two things that you want the next plan to get right.
Well, I think when you read the current comprehensive plan, the first thing that I've found really hit me hard was how differently we talked about and I think thought about and then acted on our thoughts about the question of racial equity back when it was written. It just feels dated on that question. And I think updating a comprehensive plan so that it's written consistent with the way that our community thinks and talks about equity in 2021 is really, really pivotal. And I think to the extent that we think of these plans as guiding development and zoning, it's really, really critical, because fundamentally, I think we thought about racial segregation in a different way back then, frankly. That was my feeling when I read the document. I sort of kept feeling like, wow, I don't think about segregation today in the same way as it was thought about then. And you feel that transition, right? I mean, like, look, the fact that there's no school in the Fifth Ward is in part at least a reflection of the fact that it used to seem like the right solution to the problem of segregation to say, we'll shut down your institutions and put you on a bus and tear apart your community to some extent in the meantime. And, you know, as long as my kids don't have to get on a bus, everything's fine, right? I'm not suggesting that that was the prevailing attitude when this comprehensive plan was written, you know, decades after the closure of Foster School, but I think the trajectory in our thinking about these questions has moved a long way since the time a few decades ago when that was written, and I think that's going to be a really critical piece of the rewrite.
Well, Dan, that you've touched on an important thing, segregation. You live in a census tract that has more Black Lives Matter signs than Black Lives.
It's not even close.
But I'm assuming that that's not the reason that you moved to your neighborhood. When I moved to Evanston, coming out of Rogers Park, I had the general sense that I knew what the basic demographic makeup of Evanston was, but I had not broken it down block by block by block by block. And I was actually kind of surprised to find as much division in where people live as there is. And you go back historically and you look at the actors who were responsible for most of that. And my reading of it is that it was not so much the city itself as the real estate and finance industries who are now perhaps arguably the beneficiaries of our reparations policy, or at least the money is going to be channeled through those funds. And so that's one of the reasons it's coming in for some criticism, both from portions of the Black community as well as folks who are opposed to the concept of reparations generally. Those are two different. So I guess my question is, what can we actively do to make Evanston less segregated? And how can we put some pressure, and this is my own prejudice here, that I feel that there has to be active engagement by the real estate community to be actively recruiting and telling folks this is a great place to live for everybody, and doing the opposite of steering. And how do you do that, however, without gentrifying historically what are now considered historically African-American communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very hard problem. And I certainly agree with a big chunk, certainly as regards me personally, I agree in toto with the premise of your question, which is that we live where we live because a realtor thought to show it to us because, well, for whatever reason, but I think we can surmise that the realtor might have been less inclined to show a Black family our home.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, I don't know in that particular instance, but you know, the pattern is the pattern. I'm not really sure what. I mean, obviously the city has powerful levers to deploy in trying to persuade the kind of world of developers to behave differently. It's a little bit trickier to figure out how to through the city's existing levers try to influence the behavior of. It's not even, of course, yes, it's the real estate industry, but you know, we're talking about a whole bunch of individual realtors who are certainly not any longer explicitly trained to act in the ways that we're talking about, right? We're talking about much more implicit kind of habit, culture, the folk ways of the profession, rather than there being a manual like these manuals we've read that certainly that used to exist. So I think that's a difficult question. I think there still is plenty the city can do. I think part of
is it something the city should do? Should we even be engaged in that type of what some call social engineering?
Well, I think that racial segregation is harmful to the city of Evanston. And so I think it is an appropriate policy goal for us to try to eliminate barriers to integration. And if that includes utilizing the legal authority that we have to seek collaboration from private entities, I think that's totally appropriate, absolutely. But I don't think there's any sense in doing it if we don't have clarity on what exactly the mechanisms are and what kind of success we can expect. But I think there's other things that we can do. So I mean, the Fifth Ward School is, of course, an extremely famous and heart-wrenching example, but it's not the only example of disparities across our community in availability and quality of public services. That goes all the way to the level of sidewalk repair. And I think a basic first step is for the city to take seriously the responsibility of true equity and access to public services across Evanston. Because I think the steerage that you're talking about is reliant on certain assumptions that people have of disparities in access to public services. That's a tool that we can deploy. I think there are tools in the zoning code that we can deploy. I think, this, I think the example of the 5/5 tip may or may not be the right tactic to deploy, but I think using kind of the city's financial tools as well to provide the subsidy for both development and residents that would help integrate is also something we ought to be looking at. And I don't think we will benefit if we try to fool ourselves into believing that these problems are easy or the problems can be solved entirely by public sector intervention. It's clear there is some self-segregation that occurs, but I think we make a mistake if we preemptively surrender by assuming that it really is entirely about self-segregation and therefore, hey, what can the government really do?
There was probably more than one, but there's at least one study I'm aware of that shows that the suburbs, and especially the inner ring suburbs of Chicago, are fed primarily by the proximate Chicago neighborhoods. And in other words, folks from the northwest side tend to move out to the northwest suburbs, folks from the south side move to the south suburbs, and Evanston is fed largely by people who used to live in Lakeview, Lincoln Park, Ravenswood, etc. That area has gentrified significantly over the past 30 years, so the quote feeder population of Evanston has become, in a lot of ways, less diverse. So are we swimming upstream? Are we doing anything marketing or survey study wise to figure out why people move to Evanston, what they're looking for, and what we could do differently, if we should be doing something at all to try and either preserve or change the mix?
Yeah, I certainly take your point about swimming upstream. I mean, Chicago is the Chicago area. Chicago is a famously segregated city with terrible consequences. So in that sense, I think swimming upstream is the right metaphor, that as that segregation persists in the region, in the 3 million person kind of hub of the region directly to our south, there's only so much that we could do. Again, I don't think that means that there's nothing that we could do. And as far as I'm not aware of a new survey that's going on, but I think there's a lot of clarity about why people come to Evanston. People come to Evanston many instances because of our public schools. People come to Evanston because of a desire for proximity to the city while maintaining a kind of a suburban lifestyle. And ironically enough, white people come to Evanston, they say, because they like the diversity, which both, as you put it, if it's only white people coming in, that impairs our diversity, but also it's a little odd to say, I want to be here for the diversity, and also I'm going to move to the neighborhood that is least diverse.
Famously, Rick was asked, why did you come to Casablanca? And he said, I came here for the waters. And he said, but there are no waters in Casablanca. That was mission formed. Connie.
I don't want to. Don't you get the mic for the recording? I'm sorry, that's what I'm telling people.
You're so soft spoken.
No, I'm not. I don't want to stay on this topic forever. I just have one specific question. We at one time had an equity officer in Evanston. However, that equity officer had no budget except for salary. And now we don't have an equity officer. And I believe the intent of the equity officer, besides education of staff, was to look at every issue that came up in Evanston with an equity lens and help the council to do the same. where do you see us going in terms of that? Are we going to go back and get another equity officer? Are we going to give him a budget or her budget? Or do we have no approach?
I don't think we should have a new approach in the following sense. I do think it's important to have a person who is, whether it's all of their job or part of their job, that's a, an organizational management question that's probably above my pay grade. But a person who's responsible for making sure that we have processes in place to assess everything we do through an equity lens. That's something that we say that we do. I don't think it's true. I'll give you a concrete example. I'll give you a non-concrete example. We've been talking in the Evanston, in the Rules Committee of the City Council about the question of, should we create a new process where if a council member, before a vote occurs, is worried they don't have enough information about the impact that a proposed item would have on a key priority, like equity, like sustainability, like the budget, that they could put a stop to things and ask staff to conduct an analysis. And the reaction was, hey, let's not create a new rule about that, because actually what we need to do is expect that every time we're going to vote on something, the memo that we get is going to answer those questions up front. And so the memo in the packet that's published a few days before the city council meeting will, for every item, say, here is staff's assessment of the impact of this item on our equity goals. So that doesn't mean we're talking about putting it in place, but it has not been in place. And so for many legislative items that occur, there'll be a real conversation about equity, but maybe sometimes there won't. I would say every significant decision that our city council, that our city government, I should say, not our council, that our city government makes, whether it's an HR decision of promotion or hiring or dismissal, or whether it's the creation of a new program, or whether it's a constituent outreach decision, ought to be assessed through this question of what are we doing to advance our equity goals? And we're not all the way there yet. And that's going to require it being somebody's job. As an aside, I would also argue that it requires a greater degree of clarity, specificity, and community agreement on the question of what precisely our equity goals are. And, well, point taken, but I think I worry that it is too easy to just sort of say equity and move on, because we haven't done the work to come to a true, relatively rigorous agreement on what is truly meant by equity and what specific goals we're trying to advance, and therefore measure any proposal against.
So would I be out of order to ask you to define what you mean by the term equity or equity goals when you use it?
I rule that question in order.
So the answer to your question is no, you would not be out of order. And so, I think there are a few concrete realities that I would describe as inequities that exist in Evanston. The most obvious, of course, is around wealth. But there are other significant ones around health, around mobility, right? Access to transportation and the ability to get to a job. Around, and sort of goes in with the health bucket, but really around environment, around the cleanliness of the air that a person has access to breathe, and the water that a person has access to drink. I forget if I already said education, but if I did, I should say it again. It's really important, education. And if I didn't, I said it now. So I would start by saying these are the fundamental areas where we see in our lived experience in Evanston, there are inequities, and our goal as a city is to narrow those gaps, to eliminate all barriers that we have the ability to control, that are preserving wealth gaps, that are preserving health gaps, that are preserving educational gaps, that are preserving mobility gaps. And that's to me the point. The point is to acknowledge that these differences in outcomes are in part connected to actions that we take as a city, and to commit to taking different actions to narrow those gaps.
Yes, another question regarding the comprehensive plan.
Please come up.
Okay, so the question from Laurie was, what were the two main points? So one was racial equity, or whatever equity we've discussed now for a while. Do you have another point?
Sure.
For example, for example, one point that we neighbors often feel is like in the old comprehensive general plans, especially further in the past, the importance of residential neighborhoods, the quality of life that should be upheld in residential neighborhoods.
Candidly, that wasn't the example I was going to give when I sort of rudely almost cut you off. So in the interest of transparency, I'll tell you what I was going to say, which was around, it was certainly the case when that comprehensive plan was written that Evanstonians were committed to environmental issues and sustainability, but I think the way we thought about those issues was very different because we were in a very different and much better place regarding climate change. And I think both the centrality of climate change itself and unfortunately the critical resilience question of dealing with the existing and worsening effects of climate change, I think will be a real difference in any comprehensive plan we would make now compared with that. But I mean, I take your point. The whole purpose of the comprehensive plan is to articulate a vision for what we want life here to be like. And I think, I forget the exact phrase used, but livability or quality of life in neighborhoods that's like quality of life, because we all live in neighborhoods.
It would go together with this idea of the climate change. In other words, not make the neighborhoods and increase pollution of any kind of form, or there can be noise pollution, or traffic, or those types of things. That would impact also the idea of being if you can destroy your neighborhood by increasing those factors that actually make it livable.
Yeah, I mean, I always want to, in the interest of transparency, stress that I think these questions are balancing acts in all cases, right? I mean, traffic is bad and cars make me sad, but and zero traffic and zero cars is a great goal, but as long as the expectation of most Americans is that they're going to have cars, zero cars is essentially a zero people goal, which is not a good goal either. And so, I think we have to view all of these questions as balancing questions. I think the climate ramifications of that exact set of questions is complex, right? Because for Evanston, I care about Evanston's emissions because they're a part of our global emissions, right? So if we shrink Evanston's emissions by pushing people to live in McHenry County and commute in their cars for 2 hours to get to their work, that's not a pro-sustainability posture either. So I think these are very complex balancing questions. I think the relationship between density and climate and quality of life and affordability is deeply complex. And we need a framework to actually assess those trade-offs. I think right now, lacking a comprehensive plan that we believe in, we don't have a framework to assess those trade-offs, and then we're left making kind of ad hoc one-off decisions that leave people pretty perplexed as to where the decision came from. And once you're perplexed, you're likely to get upset because you don't really see a justification.
Daniel, I'm going to follow up on and try and tie in a couple of things you said with something that's sort of key to the goal of Central Street Neighbors. One of the inequalities that many in this room have sensed over the years is the way in which proposals, ideas, and spending are treated by City Council. We had a referendum that passed overwhelmingly to preserve the Civic Center. That seems to be being disregarded right now, and we're moving in the direction of at least strongly considering getting rid of it. There was a large movement citywide, 1,000, 2,000 yard signs up to preserve branch libraries. Those two, the branch libraries on Chicago Avenue and on Central Street, which was beloved by this neighborhood, have been taken away. People had to push and pull, kick and scream to try and hold on to Harley Clark, and the city agreed to, but only on the condition that it won't spend a dime on the structure. CGE and others argued for a sustainability program and coordinator. We end up with one person, Kumar, doing work like the equity officer without staff. We're supposed to be the most sustainable, livable city in the country, but you don't even get a staffer to help you with that. It seems that if there's a citizen initiative, there's never money. We're broke. It's like John Fogerty saying, when the tax man comes, his house looks like a rummage sale, right? But somebody wants a TIF. I don't recall any crowds coming down to the Civic Center saying, Fifth Ward TIF, Fifth Ward TIF. I don't recall yards saying, we want the TIF, we want the TIF. But $100 grand for consultant study, no problem, we've got that. All sorts of things that nobody's asked for. A 311 program, which very few cities had, if they're Evanston size. We seem to have no problem coming up with the money for things that people don't want, but things that people have, in some instances, held referendums for and had citywide movements on. There's a lot of that going. So, I can say this because I'm not running for anything. Do you have the same sense? Is there something
perplexed about your political
about this perception?
Why wouldn't you say that if you're running for something? I don't know, maybe. I think it's fair to say that there's a lack of clarity around what the city's priorities are, and therefore how these decisions are getting made. I don't think what's going on now with the Civic Center discussions is inappropriate given the referendum. That referendum was kind of a while ago. I don't have a position on what the right outcome is, but I think it's a perfectly healthy discussion and one that's respectful of the community given the number of years that occurred since that referendum. But I think the basic, I'm trying to figure out how to really structure an answer here. I think we sort of have people in town who sort of don't pay any attention at all, and then we have people in town who pay an awful lot of attention. We of course have a lot more people per capita who pay an awful lot of attention than most towns, but they're still, a relatively small minority. And I think as a city, we haven't figured out how to deal with that, right? We feel sort of overwhelmed with input, but we want to remind ourselves that, yeah, it's an overwhelming amount of input, but it's still coming from a small slice of the community. You don't want them to allow those who speak to drown out all of those who may have an opinion but aren't speaking out. And that's a healthy attitude for sure, right? You don't want to govern by who shows up at the Civic Center on a Monday night. That would be a highly inequitable way to govern. But I do unfortunately agree with the premise of the question that sometimes in an effort to make sure we don't make that mistake, we've gone the opposite direction and sort of discounted the voices of a particular slice of activists, because the feeling is, well, ultimately they're just 5% of the population, and so it's a mistake to let them go too far. I don't think the right answer is to recalibrate I don't think we need to toggle the dial that just says, oh, listen more, to input. I think we need to toggle something much more fundamental that I alluded to earlier. I forget in response to which question, which is how do we construct the relationship with residents? I think it needs to be a fundamentally collaborative relationship where we are trying to solve problems together, where we say the 700 people who work for the city of Evanston are great people who are doing a wonderful job, but there's simply not enough of them to do everything we want to achieve together. And so we are going to open our doors and engage in a true partnership on a real level, not just a kind of, you can, at our direction, show up to a particular volunteer event one time and then we'll say thank you, you go home again. But we're really going to partner on a level of thinking, on a level of values, on a level of program design, and then rely on you to continue that partnership by being a part of the actual execution of the functions of what our community demands. I won't even say the functions of city government, I'll say the functions of our shared communal demands. And I think we're not doing that right now. I think because we're not doing that, people feel, they feel a certain amount of this that you did. They also, they feel kind of not very respected. And they also feel like, well, if everything I suggest is impossible, then either you guys aren't very good at doing things because all the things are impossible, or else you don't care about my opinion. And those are two toxic roads that a resident could easily walk down in reaction to that feeling. And so I have this, like to give a really concrete example, we've got to replace Kumar. And I've been, talking to the people doing the job interviews and the people who wrote the job postings saying, front load public engagement. There's a ton of expertise that I desperately want Kumar 2.0 to have. Right, I sat with Kumar across the table from a bunch of combat executives in fancy suits. And as I was yelling at combat executives in fancy suits about the fact that they're basically a criminal cartel, it was very, very useful to have someone as knowledgeable as Kumar sitting next to me to provide the technical assistance in that conversation. I want his replacement to have that, but you know what? That expertise already resides in this community in the form of people who want to help. What we can't do without is having that replacement have the organizing skills and community relation commitment to bring all of that expertise in the door. So I fear that this, when it comes to the question of like, why did the libraries close? This may sound like I'm dodging a little bit. But I hope I'm speaking to the underlying root cause. And I do think this change in attitude that we at the city have to effectuate is the real solution. So I don't know.
I don't mean to put you in too tough a spot, but as an officer of this organization, and I'm taking you serious on your challenge that we push you a little bit. Barack Obama made the same challenge after he got elected, and some folks found, well, if you push, then you got pushed back at by David Axelrod. So,
or a man,
or yes,
a man who knows how to push.
Yes. So I guess I would sum up by saying there is a sense that there is a strain of anti-populism or anti-small d democracy in Evanston. Some of us have heard activist used as a pejorative in city council chambers. And so I'm asking you to do what you can to try and stem that. There's been some recent, I would hope, breakthroughs in that, but only on the issue of race. And I hope that we can extend the same respect to a panoply of issues in Evanston.
Yeah, do you mind if I respond to that, since David Axelrod is not available to push back?
I don't mean to take his name. I like David.
So point taken, and yes, the answer to your request is yes. I just wanted to add one more thing to this, and Eleanor's poor Councilmember Revelle has heard me give this speech a million times, and in public and in private. Now she's got to sit through it again. But I think, we had this campaign, and whatever it was, March and April, where there was a lot of sort of not very illuminating discussion on the question of what form of government we ought to have. And so it's hard to bring that up because I think it harkens back to that campaign, which was so unilluminating, but I think I want to talk about it for a second. Whatever form of government you have, it's going to have benefits and costs. And the form of government that we have, which has many benefits, its chief cost, in my opinion, is an insulation of the operation of city government from the public, right? If a city of Chicago employee is creating a situation that makes it really hard for Lori Lightfoot to get reelected, the fact that that employee works for Lori Lightfoot is really important, right? And that mechanism of public input is fundamental to how that form of government works. We don't have that form of government. We have a very different form of government where the work being done by our city staff is being done by people who our city council does not hire, cannot fire, should not try to interfere with their conditions of employment. And so that means the residents are just a little further. They're just a little further from some of the tables inside city government than they would be in a different form of government. I'm not saying that to advocate for changing it. I'm not advocating to change it. I'm saying that is a fact. That is a downside of the current arrangement that we have accepted because of the upsides it also brings. But good Lord, then we have a responsibility to try to mitigate that downside. We, the elected officials, are now really the only access point for the public with strong accountability. And so we've got to really bring y'all in because nobody else is going to do that work. That's something we're thinking a lot about how to do that, how to effectuate that internal culture change to ensure that the accountability that we do have as elected officials to the communities that we were selected to serve, how that accountability can be most effectively transferred to the operations of city government and to the staff without trying to reach into all the stuff that we deliberately try to avoid, of politicization of employment and, payback, getting involved in that and threatening people with their jobs. We don't do any of that stuff, but we still want the accountability, and that's what we got to work on.
Come on up there, Lou.
I'd just like to hear your feeling about having more aldermen. Instead of, we had 18 once, we went down to 9. If you could have 12 or something, that you could have 3 that were floaters or redistrict to bring more people more involved, I think. You have your own little section, which may work better than I think we're all polarized to some degree. So is more aldermen any solution? Can you see that?
It's a great question. I will tell you that I've thought about this question a lot, but I don't have answers. So I'm going to just tell you kind of how I've been thinking about it, but say that I'm open to suggestion. And I do think this is the kind of decision that it would be a crime to make without real serious community engagement. I do think it's timely though, right? There's the next election is in April of 2025, and we're going to get the census data relatively soon, and so redistricting will occur before that election occurs, and so now is the right time to think about whether we want to change our structure. Okay, with that out of the way, personally, my instinct is the opposite of yours. If you look at communities of sort of mid-sized communities in Illinois, and you just look per capita, how many members of their governing body do they have? We've got a lot. Most other communities have more residents per rep, whether it's a trustee or a council member, than we do. Candidly, I agree with your diagnosis strongly. I think these little wards create an opportunity for parochialism that run the risk of dividing us too much. So I'm interested in thinking about other ways to address it. You're right that adding at-large council members might be one solution. A very simple solution, of course, would be to shrink the council so that each ward was larger. Not suggesting that right now, council member. Another option that I've thought about a lot is you can think back to the old days before 1982, I guess it was, when the Illinois legislature had 3-member districts. Imagine if we had 3 wards, but each elected 3 council members at large. Right, then you would have 3 people working together representing a larger area, less polarization. There's important questions to be asked there. I think especially the kind of cultural identity of the 5th ward is something that might be impaired by that proposal. That'd be something I'd be really concerned about. But I think it's worth thinking creatively about other models. I think going to an all at-large system like all of our neighbors have is not something that feels right to me, because I think we're just a little bit too large and a little bit too complicated for that. But whether it's multiple member districts or adding a few at-large seats or shrinking the districts altogether, I think we ought to consider structural changes that would be designed to improve the collaboration and across the community.
Carol, I think this will be our last question.
Can you hear me, or would you like me to use the mic?
I can hear you, but we have a diverse audience and
Thank you. Nice to see you, Mayor Biss, and thank you so much for coming. Carolyn Laughlin. And you've referenced several times this evening the idea that Evanston could build community and perhaps develop some better outcomes for the city by opening the windows and enabling more people to partake, leveraging the expertise you mentioned several times this evening. I think a really good example of this is the way you've put together your Reimagining Public Safety team. And as I've watched those meetings, I've been very impressed with the diversity of the voices and how carefully you constructed that team so that you would make sure that you heard from all corners of the community. My question to you is based on the fact that you are obviously a very skilled facilitator, and you've been able to manage that group very effectively. If we're going to open the windows and we're going to have more staff and perhaps our council members as well tap into the expertise and the energy and the passion of Evanstonians, they're going to have at least some of the skills that you bring to your team. And I'm just sort of wondering what your thoughts are on that and how we can build that capability so that we can achieve what you're doing with Reimagining Public Safety. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your enormously generous compliments that I don't fully feel are earned, but thank you. And it is really, one thing I do agree with is about the quality of the people who were generous enough to serve on the Reimagining Public Safety Committee. They're wonderful, and I'm very, very appreciative of their giving of their time. And I'm appreciative that you and other community members are choosing to sit in on these meetings, which, you know, no one feels the need to go to another meeting, but it's so important that community members are engaging and listening and participating in that. So thank you for that. I agree with the premise that this is not a snap your fingers thing. This is a practice, and it's a skill set. That's part of why I talked about the hiring process to replace Kumar, right? And I sort of gave a long, complicated thing with a weird comedy anecdote because I got distracted. But the point I was trying to make is that there's no human being who's got all the different skills that an ideal sustainability coordinator or sustainability chief sustainability officer would have. There's so many different things we're trying to select for. And what I'm saying is, as we balance between those different skills, let's put extra weight on the public engagement, facilitation, collaboration with stakeholders aspect of it, because if you do that properly, it can then make you better at bringing in the people who can help make up for some of the technical questions, the technical issues that a person who we've selected in that way may lack. And so I think the moment that we hire new people, especially in these key roles, is a critical moment of opportunity. And I do think people can just change in their attitudes. You know, we have this opportunity that our city manager is new. You know, not brand new any longer, but pretty darn new, and still establishing patterns. And her relationship with the staff as their number one, you know, top boss is new, and those patterns are being established. I think it's a time for enumerating a new set of expectations and working with her to communicate those through the organization. And you're right, Carolyn, there are people in our organization who are, you know, let's say, not to use a stereotype, but let's say great engineers for whom collaboration with the general public may not be their number one skill, and that's okay. But there's other people in the organization who are more just personally kind of inclined to that kind of collaboration. And then again, there's, you know, every time a new job comes open, particularly a senior position or a position in a content area where this kind of collaboration could be beneficial, we just need to be willing to say, it's okay to make some sacrifices when it comes to other criteria if we're getting a truly extraordinary person, both in their skill and commitment to public engagement and participation.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to everybody for coming out. I'm going to wind up with a comment, and then I'll offer you a chance to say your farewells. This follows on Carolyn's observation and a couple of things you've said. The Central Street Neighbors has been around 14 or 15 years. We were formally incorporated in 2007, right, David? And our membership is built up from being 11 people originally to fluctuated between 150 to almost 300 during most of our existence. And since I was on the board of both organizations at one point at the same time, I know that we had more actual paid members than the Democratic Party of Evanston in some years. But the city of Evanston has not regularly reached out to us. Some of the aldermen have. It's great to see Alderman Revelle here, and we've had Liz Tisdale and Jane Grover and Mark Tendam and Tom Sefferman have been in our meetings. But things happen, including on things affecting our neighborhood or the broader Central Street neighborhood, and there's no outreach to us as a stakeholder, whereas you would never think of doing something affecting some other communities you can think of without reaching out to the point organizations that may or may not represent the view of everybody. You said, you know, I've heard this from a couple of city officials over the years that, well, just because 100 people show up at City Hall doesn't mean that they represent the rest of Evanston, but I don't see that same type of dismissiveness when other groups show up. My experience is that for every person that shows up at City Hall, there's at least 2, 3, 5, maybe 100 people sitting at home going, "You go, girl." You know, I'm glad you're doing it because I don't like speaking in public. I don't have time to get to the meeting. I've got 2 kids to feed, et cetera, and that we've been able to sustain as an organization over the years because people seem to support what we're doing. It's not just because we're a great, effective marketing group of cranks. Because we're not. We still send out, you know, yellow postcards on, you know, craft paper from Office Depot. So yeah, you know, I think we've just learned about this internet thing. What I'm saying is that
overrated.
Is that I think it would be fair in the absence of evidence to the contrary to assume that folks who show up at City Hall and folks like the Central Street Neighbors Association represent the tip of a larger iceberg, and we don't know the mass of that iceberg. It might not be the same as water to ice, but that actually it represents something. And so my plea, because we don't demand, is that we be considered a stakeholder, and that the folks of North Evanston not be subject to any greater marginalization than any other group in Evanston. We thank you for coming out. I hope this has been a productive evening.
I feel like the duration of that applause, we should be done now. But now I'm talking. So first of all, maybe you should demand things more often. That seems to be the lesson. I think that's a really, really fair point. I've only been the mayor for 7 weeks, so I haven't, established a lot of patterns. And, candidly, there aren't a lot of Central Street issues that have come before me, at least personally. But I would like to think that if one did, I would reach out. And I think it's certainly correct that the only reasonable way to interpret a whole bunch of people showing up at the Civic Center is that they're representing something real, whose magnitude you perhaps can't measure, but maybe don't need to worry about exactly what the magnitude is, because it is, in fact, something real. But beyond that, it just seems to me that a situation where I can show up to speak to a group like this and then be told that the expectation is that if there's going to be an item under consideration that's directly affecting the area that this group works on, that the expectation is that no one would hear anything, that's just a breeding ground for the opposite of the kind of relationship that we ought to be striving for. Whatever else, whatever the reason, whatever the history, it doesn't matter. That fact pattern generates a kind of distrust and a kind of suspicion, a feeling of alienation, ultimately a concern of kind of synthetic disenfranchisement, you might say. And it's not good for our community. So my commitment to you is, yeah, I will be in touch. My ask of you, because I really don't make demands, I'm just the mayor, is for you to be in touch, both Megan and Jeff, with the group more broadly. As Mary will attest, I answer my phone calls, I respond to my texts, I answer my emails unless they're from out-of-state Fox News watchers. Be in touch. Let us know what's on your mind. Let me know how you would like to educate me. Let me know what it is that you think I ought to be thinking about or learning or listening to or reading that I'm not already doing. Because it is extremely obvious, so obvious that it's almost a painful cliche to even say out loud, that we'll all be better off as a community if we're able to collaborate effectively. And so that's what I would like to see happen. I am well aware of the feelings that have built up to some extent over the course of 15 years, but I would argue more significantly, relatively recently, that the attitude of our city government is kind of like, well, we're running a really great operation here. Too bad about those 75,000 residents who keep getting in the way. And it doesn't always matter if that's true. If that impression is being conveyed, then we automatically have a problem on our hands. So I am here to change that impression. I'm here to change that impression by ensuring that that impression is not consistent with reality, because that's the most important way that the right impression can be generated. And I'm really glad that you invited me to be here. I think your questions were probably a little bit too easy. So I hope you'll invite me back for a thorough grilling. But I'm really appreciative of this. I found this conversation constructive. I hope you did too. I tried to be honest and direct and not dodge the questions, even if I spoke for too long. I hope that came across. And I'll just end by saying, and I know this is sort of maudlin, and I'm sure people are sick to death of hearing me say it, but it feels so good to be together in person. It just feels wonderful. Thank you for doing this. It's really a gift to me, so I appreciate it.
you, Daniel. We'll accept your invitation. Consider this a first date.